Danish illustrator Kay Nielsen was born in Copenhagen in 1886. Both his parents were successful in the Danish theatre, his father a director and his mother a celebrated actor. Nielsen studied art in Paris at both the Académie Julian and Académie Colarossi for the best part of 7 years, between 1904 and 1911, so he obviously felt no pressing need to rush into professional life. But in 1910, and still technically a student, he created a remarkably engrossing series of detailed pen and ink drawings collected under the rather misleading title The Book of Death, as the images were not actually published as such. But all of this collection gave a clear indication of his graphic abilities and his abiding romantic fascination with the darker side of existence. The drawings were clearly influenced by the work of Aubrey Beardsley, but Nielsen added some interesting techniques of his own with the use of sprayed ink areas which were both distinctive and atmospheric. With his studies finally ended, he relocated to England, where he had an exhibition of his drawings, including the Death collection, at a London gallery. It was a great success and received praise from the critics. This effectively launched his career in illustration, and in that year he was commissioned to illustrate the book in powder and crinoline. It was published in 1913 as a limited edition of 500, and this volume of traditional fairy tales, retold by Arthur Quiller Crouch, constituted a particularly large and prestigious project for a novice illustrator, consisting of 24 full-colour images as well as some line-only monochromes. Along with the enduring Beardsley influence, there was also evidence of the stylisation found in the art of both the Middle and Far East. Nevertheless, it was his graceful line drawing which lay at the foundation of his work, even in colour. His characters were invariably drawn in a formal-mannered style which resonated with the grace of Art Nouveau, but it was also predictive to an extent of the more geometrically structured Art Deco. All the elements in any given picture were first and foremost subject to the aesthetic demands of the composition and posed carefully within elaborately realised, highly fanciful scenery. The book was a significant popular success, and more work of a similar nature inevitably followed. In the same year, Nielsen was also commissioned by the Illustrated London News to produce a set of 4 illustrations to accompany the tales of Charles Perrault for the Christmas issue of the magazine. And if anything, they were possessed of even more meticulous, exquisite beauty than the crinoline and powder images. Every detail was drawn with the finest of lines, and the colouring, created with washes of watercolour, roamed freely between large wash areas and remarkably intricate patterning and texture in selected areas. The effect was visually mesmerising and compelled the viewer to study the image for the longest possible time. Only a year later, in 1914, Nielsen provided 25 colour plates and more than 21 monochrome line images for another collection of fantasy tales titled East of the Sun and West of the Moon. It was published as a limited edition of only 500 copies, which unsurprisingly sold out very quickly to collectors. The book was subtitled Old Tales from the North, and Nielsen would have been familiar with many of these fantasy tales from his own childhood in Denmark. Once more, his slender figures were captured within a range of scenic environments, many, although not all, of which were rather empty and bleak in nature. And solid black featured regularly to push the characters to the fore when it suited his purposes. There were some small inky monochromes too, but they couldn't begin to compete with the majesty and sense of romantic gloom and heroism suggested by the colour pages. But that year also saw the outbreak of the Great War, and with it came an austerity which would put to an end the production of such lavish books, and other than a couple of illustrations for a Joan of Arc project which never saw the light of day, it would be a long time before Nielsen returned to the illustration of books. In 1917 he sailed to New York, where an exhibition of his work was held, and he subsequently returned to Copenhagen and briefly painted stage sets and designed costumes for the Royal Danish Theatre. But he also began work on an extensive series of illustrations for a proposed translation of the Arabian Nights. They were intended to mark his return to book illustration when the war ended, and it was planned that it would be simultaneously published in Denmark, Britain and France. But for reasons I've been unable to ascertain, the book was never completed, and the illustrations Nielsen had created for this abandoned project weren't discovered and published until many years later. Given the undoubted magnificence and narrative persuasiveness of these meticulous orientally styled illustrations and their highly exotic qualities, it's hard to imagine why they were not published, and if anyone out there does know the reason, I'd be grateful for the knowledge. But published or not, this was a body of astonishing and compelling illustration, which is generally recognised now as one of the most significant of the Golden Age. Unfortunately, that didn't do Nielsen any good in his lifetime. Following a total absence of almost a decade from bookwork, his illustrated edition of Sous le signe de Rossignol, written by Henri Jacques, was published in Paris as a limited edition of 1,500 copies. Despite the extended and unexplained inactivity, the quality of the work in this book was every bit as skillful and imaginative as his earlier projects. In the same year, In Powder and Crinoline was published again in the USA, now with the title 12 Dancing Princesses. But in 1924 he produced what has become widely recognised as one of his greatest accomplishments. Fairy Tales by Hans Andersen was published as a limited edition of 500 copies and contained a dozen full-colour plates and a dozen more equally delicate stylised pen and ink monochromes. He had actually begun work on this series of illustrations as early as 1912, and why it had taken so long to be published I really don't know. But Andersen's largely romantic fantasy narratives were a perfect match for Nielsen's own light touch, and his work for this project stood out from the many other versions produced at the time due to the distinctive stylisation of his graphic approach. In the following year he published another limited edition, this time of 600 copies, titled Hansel and Gretel and Other Stories. These tales from Grimm followed the identical pattern as the Andersen volume, with 12 densely rendered full-colour images and 20 monochromes in support. And as with the previous year's book, each copy was numbered and signed by Nielsen to add value to this already desirable and highly collectible volume. Where others such as Arthur Rackham had revelled in the earthy Gothic qualities of the Grimm's tales, Nielsen treated them in visual terms with precisely the same grace and romance as he had with the Andersen book. Although unlike his delicate Andersen line drawings in this instance, Nielsen executed his monochromes with a far from usual brutalist folk styling redolent of wood engraving. But following these remarkable and commercially successful publications, it would be another 5 years before another appeared. Red Magic was published in 1930, and it attempted to match the elegance and narrative power of his two successes of 5 years earlier. And although it could be said that the actual work produced, with 8 full-colour pages and around 50 monochromes, was every bit as creatively successful, the book was met with nothing like the same level of popularity, and seemed to indicate that, like others of his generation, Nielsen was rapidly starting to be considered yesterday's big thing. During this period he and Ulla had been living in Copenhagen, and by all accounts were living quite extravagantly on the money he'd made so far. Without more books it was a dwindling resource, but in 1936 he returned to the USA to work on a theatrical production at the Hollywood Bowl, and following a personal recommendation from Disney artist Joe Grant, Nielsen was offered a job at the studios as a concept artist. He was put to work as part of the team making Fantasia, and the concept art he produced for this production was plain to see in the Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria sequences. The images he created for Ave Maria were very much what would be expected given his other work, but the dark menace and grotesque images created for Night on Bald Mountain were anything but. They were created in a queasy, unearthly colour palette with dark menacing characters picked out with lighting effects. All were created using pastels and crayons, and it would be far from easy to identify them as being his work. But impressive as they were, Nielsen had quickly developed an unfortunate reputation for not being much of a team player, and he made his disdain for the fast-moving deadlines of film production known to whoever might try to get him to work at a more energetic pace. Following his work on Fantasia, which at the time was a far from popular and therefore commercially unsuccessful production, he was laid off, but rehired to create early concept work for an early proposal for The Little Mermaid. Once more, he seems to have pursued his recent fascination with the darker side of his creativity, and the atmospheric work he created was never used when this first attempt was abandoned by the studios, and he was without any income yet again. Very little evidence of it remains, but in the 1940s he was commissioned to create a couple of murals for a church and a Los Angeles school library. Rapidly running out of money, Nielsen briefly returned to Denmark, but his work was no longer in demand there either. So he headed back to the USA, and in 1952 and 53 he created some early concept work for Disney's proposed full-length adaptation of Sleeping Beauty. What little evidence remains from this project shows that yet again his mindset was profoundly dark and brooding. And when the film was finally released in 1959, Nielsen's contributions were nowhere to be seen. Throughout his lean years, Nielsen had continued to paint, but his art was unfortunately as unpopular as his illustration by this time, and he died in poverty at the age of 70 in 1957. Before her own death only a year later, Nielsen's widow Ulla gave many of his drawings and paintings to the artist and architect Frederick Monhoff, who offered them to several museums in both the USA and Denmark. Incredible as it now seems, nobody wanted them. Now, of course, his work is considered highly collectible, and so it should be. As with some others of his generation, he struggled to remain relevant in a rapidly changing cultural environment. And it's particularly unfortunate that he was unable to hold on to the lifeline thrown to him by Disney in the 1940s. But however erratic Nielsen's fortunes during his life, he has at least now secured an enduring and deserved place as one of the true great individualists of the Golden Age.